Joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for just a few minutes. There we go. Today we are having a U.S. Nature for Climate meeting to talk about the first National Nature Assessment. And so it's going to be a rather simple agenda. We're going to hear a presentation from Dr. Tessa Francis, who is the Chief of Staff for the National Nature Assessment and detailed to the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And then we will have a question and answer and discussion period afterwards. So we'll lay out the ground rules for that once we get to that. My name is Nathan Henry. I'm the director of the U.S. Nature for Climate program. Just in case you are not familiar with us, we are a coalition of 28 members that is dedicated to advancing natural climate solutions implementation in the United States. So I don't want to spend a lot of time outside of the actual meat of the discussion. So just wanted to introduce Dr. Tessa Francis, again, Chief of Staff for the National Nature Assessment Program. Dr. Francis is detailed to U.S. Global Change Research Program from the U.S. Geological Survey. There is some additional biographical information there about Dr. Francis, but rather than just kind of recapping that, I just want to turn things over to Dr. Francis, who has a presentation to share, after which we will have a discussion and question and answer period. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Dr. Francis, if you want to take over.
I will. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Nathan. It's nice to be here. I would say thank you for the invitation, but in reality, you did not invite me. You invited the director of the National Nature Assessment, Phil Levin, to come, but because he used to be the chief scientist for Washington Nature Conservancy and now works for the White House, he's not allowed to do this briefing. So he sent me in his stead. I'm going to do my best to step in his rather large shoes. But as Nathan said, I'm the Chief of Staff for the National Nature Assessment. I was hired to work at USGS for this position, who then immediately detailed me to the U.S. Global Change Research Program. I'm an ecologist. I most recently worked at the University of Washington, Tacoma for 12 years, where I was working on issues linking science and science to policy in Puget Sound recovery planning, working on issues related to nearshore habitat for fishes in Puget Sound, as well as working on a program called the Ocean Modeling Forum, where we formed interdisciplinary working groups to tackle issues of ocean management. So I'm a scientist, but now I'm wrangling this project called the National Nature Assessment. I just started in November, and so I'm still learning, but I'm happy to have this opportunity to catch you up on what the National Nature Assessment is, what we've been doing, and what we have planned. So this is mostly Phil's slide deck, and Phil, I've seen him give this talk, and he always starts by saying that nature is awesome, and I happen to agree with him, so I'm going to start there too. I think, I live on Vashon Island, which is in the middle of the Puget Sound here in the Pacific Northwest, and so I have daily opportunities to appreciate how awesome nature is. Vitally important in my life, and it's been a central feature of how I raise my children. I think all of us were reminded during the pandemic of how important nature is to our mental and physical health and well-being. Through my work, I've come to appreciate the very important benefits that nature delivers to us all the time. Nature is important for our economy, for protecting us against hazards, for our food security. It's a critical component of our cultural heritage, centrally featured in our rituals and our communities and often our language. So nature is awesome, nature is important, and we also know that nature is changing and changing rapidly before our eyes. Um, Climate change is causing changes in nature in ways that put the benefits that we derive from nature at risk. Species are moving, species are invading, um, droughts and floods are occurring in the Pacific Northwest. We're very concerned about how changes to the hydrological cycle are going to affect the Pacific salmon and that we care so much about in our region, and determine whether our rivers and streams can continue to support salmon in the future. And our land management practices are also one of the drivers that is changing nature, and not just in the sort of more obvious ways in terms of the built environment and how we manage that, but even sometimes how we manage our natural areas. Very recently, like a month ago, Phil and I went out for a tribal consultation with the Makah tribe out on the Pacific coast of Washington State, and heard from them stories about how a prairie that is part of their traditional foraging grounds, the Ozette Prairie, which for millennia was maintained through their traditional land management practices, which included burning to keep the forest at bay and keep the prairie intact. That area, that Ozette Prairie is now being managed for wilderness, which means that those traditional land management practices are now banned, which means that the forest is encroaching on the prairie, which is a story that we hear about prairies all around this country. So not only is our built environment threatening the services and benefits that we derive from nature, but sometimes our efforts at protecting nature also affect the benefits that we get from nature. And so nature is essential across a whole variety of benefits that we get from nature. It's critical to our lives, it's critical to our economy. And there's a whole lot of information out there already about how nature is changing, about the status of nature, what's causing change in nature. But surprisingly, it's never been brought together, and we've never been able to form a full picture of what's happening with nature in the US and how that matters today and how it will matter in the future. And that's what the National Nature Assessment is about. So we are conducting the first ever National Nature Assessment in recognition of this need for a holistic picture. And by we, what I mean is the US Global Change Research Program. So the US Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP, that won't be the last list of letters I'll throw at you. There's going to be a lot of alphabet soup. I'm going to do my best, but I do work for the government now. US Global Change Research Program is a program that was started in 1990 by Congress. It's a program of 15 different federal agencies, and so this image is actually out of date because we just added HUD, Housing and Urban Development, in the last couple of months. They're the newest member of the USGCRP family, and the aim is for these 15 different federal agencies to coordinate research on global change. And historically, that has been focused on climate change, but with the National Nature Assessment, USGCRP is showing recognition that changes in nature are also an important aspect of global change. And so when you look at these agencies that are part of the program, some of them are sort of the usual suspects that you think about when you think about nature: Department of the Interior, EPA, certainly National Science Foundation, but then there's some unexpected players as well, like Department of Homeland Security, USAID, Department of Transportation. So what we have here is a collection of agencies that some of whom are data producers, some of whom produce data about nature, and some of whom use data about nature to do their work, like FEMA, like Department of Homeland Security. So that's the US Global Change Research Program. We are leading the National Nature Assessment. It's actually an idea I heard most recently that that sprung from the Obama administration, but it was an executive order signed by President Biden on Earth Day 2022 that really got the ball rolling. And that executive order, which he's signing here in Washington State, you see representatives from Washington State behind him, was pretty simple. The executive order simply charged U.S. Global Change Research Program with an assessment of the condition of nature within the U.S. That was pretty much it. Thou shalt do an assessment. And the scope at that time was very, very broad. The idea was that we would assess the status, the observed trends and future projections of U.S. lands, waters, wildlife, biodiversity and ecosystems, and the benefits they provide. These benefits would include connections to economy, public health, equity, climate mitigation and adaptation, and national security. Importantly, from the very beginning, the National Nature Assessment was intended to be use-inspired and inclusive. The aim was that this not simply be yet another government report to sit on a shelf, but that it actually be relevant to people's lives, and that it be sticky and be inspired by its ability to be used, and that it be inclusive. Nature, the idea of nature, even just the definition of nature, is so incredibly broad and so diverse. Everybody has a different definition of what nature means to them and what they're seeing is changing in nature in front of them and how that matters to them. And the idea was that the National Nature Assessment would be inclusive of all of those perspectives. In particular, we, from the very beginning, the National Nature Assessment has acknowledged that there are multiple ways of knowing, and specifically attended to the fact that Indigenous knowledge is one of the many important bodies of knowledge that contribute to our collective understanding about the natural world. So we are following guidance that has been issued by the White House on the use and value of Indigenous knowledge in the National Nature Assessment. We are, throughout the entire development process of the NNA, we are conducting official tribal consultations and holding listening sessions throughout to make sure that this is an inclusive process. So that engagement and outreach was really intense in the spring and summer of 2023, moving from this very, very broad executive order that just said, thou shalt do an assessment. The question was, well, what do people want the assessment to be about? What should be included in the assessment? So we went out and we asked people. Over the months and weeks of that period of time, we issued an official call, an official request for information in the Federal Register, which returned more than 3,000 comments. We held several Native Hawaiian engagements, several official tribal consultations, many, many, many public events with representatives from over 130 organizations in 40 different states, to all of these groups and all these individuals posing the same basic set of questions. We're going to do an assessment. What should be in it? What does nature mean to you? How is nature changing, and how are those changes affecting your lives? And what would you like to see in the report? In what way would an assessment be useful to you? We took in all of that feedback, through it, looked at it, aggregated, and saw that 4 major themes emerged from all of that feedback in terms of what people were interested in and thinking about nature, the questions that they wanted us to address. Those 4 themes were conservation and natural resource management, economic interests, human health and well-being, and safety and security. And then across all of those 4 major themes, there were a couple of cross-cutting themes as well. The intersection between nature and climate, which maybe a couple of people here today might be interested in, might have some thoughts about, and then also equity. And by equity, what we mean is a couple different things. To what degree are the benefits and services that we derive from nature equitably distributed across communities or otherwise, most often the otherwise? And then how are some of the sort of drivers of nature change? How are some of the things like pollution or land conversion, how are those being unequitably borne by different communities? So those two cross-cutting themes also emerged from our listening sessions to shape the assessment. So more specifically, then we took those themes and with those listening sessions and we wrote a prospectus and published that in the Federal Register as well. I think there was a link to our prospectus in the calendar invite for this meeting. And in that prospectus, we said to the country, this is what we heard, and these are the questions that we plan to ask in our assessment. What do you think about that? So within the theme of conservation and natural resource management, the guiding questions that we will be providing to our authors as they write this assessment are, what are the existing status trends and drivers of change affecting species and ecosystems in the US? How have access to nature and to associated benefits changed and for whom? So there's the equity theme coming through here. How have culturally significant species and ecosystems changed, and what are future options for sustaining them? In the theme of economic interest, the guiding questions that came out of the listening sessions were, how many jobs are dependent on nature? And how have changes in nature affected jobs and livelihoods, and for whom? What aspects of the US economy are connected to the status and trends of nature, and what future options for advancing the economy could provide net benefits to nature and the climate? So how could we actually engage with the economy to benefit nature? And then the reverse, where would future infrastructure and economic development advance with the most benefit and least harm to nature and nature's benefits? In the human health and well-being theme, the questions that emerged were, how have changes in nature affected physical, mental, and public health, as well as the equity of health risks and benefits? What are emerging health effects from changes in nature? And what are future nature-based options that can reduce health risks for all people? And just a little bit more on the human health and well-being component. Beyond these guiding questions, we are benefiting from some work done here in the Pacific Northwest by Jamie Donatuto, who works for the Swinomish tribe, in thinking about not just, and helping us frame the NNA, not just in terms of sort of standard Western public health concepts of health and well-being, but also adding in potentially indigenous health indicators. So aspects of health like self-determination or resilience or community connection that are important ways of defining nature's benefits to our health and well-being. And then also benefiting from work by Sarah Breslow on sort of additional components of human well-being. So we have the indigenous health indicators to help us think about health, and then these additional ways of thinking about human well-being, where human well-being is thought of in terms of conditions that people experience, connections that people have, capabilities that people have or have access to, and then some cross-cutting themes related to human well-being too, like equity, certainty or resilience to the future, and then thinking about future generations. So that's just a little bit more depth on the human health and well-being theme. And then on safety and security, some of those key questions are, what losses from natural and environmental hazards have been averted by nature over time and for whom? And where and how much can nature-based solutions equitably reduce future risk from natural and environmental hazards? And then how have trends and spatial patterns in nature affected food and water security and for whom? And what are opportunities for nature-based solutions to avert some emerging food and water security risks? So those are the themes. We are writing a report. The report as I've said, will be shaped by these key questions that were derived from listening sessions with different user groups identified through a public engagement. But what we also heard in those listening sessions when we were asking, what types of products would be useful to you beyond just a government report, what we heard again and again and again, public and tribal input both emphasized the diversity of perspectives that people hold on nature and the impacts of nature, and a need for people to actually express that in their own voices. And so beyond sort of saying, okay, here's how science and the scientists are going to describe changes in nature, status and trends in nature, and changes in its benefits, but we're also going to pull on other voices and other communities to do the same exercise, but alongside the assessment report. So we have these so-called associated products that we're working on, and they include things that are very tentative, so I can't really be too specific about them, but an art contest and art exhibits, a poetry anthology, a film festival, maybe a cookbook. So we're bringing in different voices using different media to help connect these questions about nature and nature's change to people, to help make this a really useful exercise. So here's our list of chapters, which really looks very similar to the sort of high-level themes that I shared with you. And I need to say that this is subject to change. These aren't written down anywhere. They're not published anywhere. We're not beholden to these yet, so they may change. But through all of this work and thinking through what this report could be, we thought that it would be useful to have, at the very beginning of the report, it would be useful to have some good stories, some positivity. So we added a couple of chapters. One is Bright Spots in America's Nature, which will really, the idea there is that it would be a compilation of case studies, positive stories, things that are happening that we can look to as being positive signs for the future. And then opportunities for America's Nature is similar, but more thinking about policies that are in place that are having positive effects on nature and nature's benefits, and that might be scalable. They're presently maybe operating at a small scale, but they could be scaled up. Then we have these kind of, standard chapters on status and trends of nature, status and trends of the drivers of change of nature. Then 4 chapters that are really about kind of nature's benefits. So nature and human health and well-being, safety and security, cultural heritage, and economy. Talked about those. Then we have these 2 cross-cutting chapters, nature and climate change and equity and nature. Each of these other chapters will also have climate and equity in them woven in, but we're also going to be pulling out 2 separate chapters on their own to emphasize the importance of nature intersection with climate change and equity. And then we're going to have a chapter that's sort of a methods chapter across all these sort of the diversity of these different chapters in the report. So that's preliminary chapter list. So where are we now, and where are we going next in this process? So I mentioned that we had these listening sessions. There was a request for information. There was a lot of listening. There were listening sessions, tribal consultations. We wrote and published a prospectus, got some comments back on the prospectus. We issued a call for authors in the fall. And from that call for authors, we selected our chapter leads, and our full chapter leadership team has been selected, like as of today. We're waiting on one more final confirmation of yes from one final chapter lead. So hopefully that will be completed today. The chapter leadership is going to spend the rest of this winter and the spring building and onboarding our author teams, with the goal of having our first outline, very sort of course outline that just sort of chapter by chapter outlines the topics that will be addressed by summer of 2024. Our hope is that it will be published and available by ESA. There will be opportunities for public comment and tribal consultation and public engagement around that outline in the fall 2024. And then the idea is that we will have our first draft in the fall of 2025. So that draft goes out also for public comment. It goes for peer review to the national academies. We hold tribal consultations and more engagements around that first draft. Authors revise in response to those comments, and then our final draft is due in 2026. And here is this QR code, which feels still so goofy to do this, but I guess I'm told I'm supposed to. It's a QR code that's going to take you to the website if you want more information about the NNA, and to keep updated on announcements and next steps as we go forward. And with that, I will stop sharing and we can have a conversation. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much for that presentation, Tessa. So for the question and answer period, I think the best way to go would be if you do have a question or a comment you'd like to make, just click on the hand raised icon, and then I will call on you. And if you do speak, please just kind of introduce yourself and say what organization you work for as well. I think there were a couple of questions in the chat. So let me just look at that. Okay, it looks like I think you already answered the question from Brenda about the timeline. Samantha.
Hello, thank you, Tessa. Really appreciate that overview. I was just wondering who your partner organizations are for this report. I'm with the Native American Agriculture Fund.
Okay, yeah, so by partner organizations, you mean who's helping, who's going to be on the author team, or who is in
Yes.
the US? Yeah, so we have not selected our authors yet. The way the author teams are structured is we have representatives from our federal agencies, so the 15 different federal agencies that make up USGCRP, who are serving as federal coordinating lead authors. So each chapter will have one federal lead author and then one non-federal chapter lead. And the chapter leads were brought in from, we were not specific about we didn't have any organizational requirements about who they worked for. It's just that we wanted to have one federal and one non-federal chapter lead for each chapter. And so the chapter leads are all non-feds, but they're from NGOs, they're from universities. So we didn't have any restrictions on who could be a chapter lead, but I can't share with you who they are because it's not finalized yet. But we'll be able to share that soon. And then those chapter leads, they will be choosing their author teams. We are giving them free range to make those choices themselves. And again, they have no restrictions or even any specific guidance about who their authors need to work for. We have guidance about diversity, and obviously we have guidance about expertise, and we have guidance about conflict of interest, and then we have guidance about diversity. So diversity across a number of different axes, like geographic diversity, gender diversity, racial diversity, a lot of different guidance there in terms of encouraging the chapter leads to put together a diverse author team. But in terms of partner organizations, we're going to end up probably with a list of maybe, so if we're expecting to have like 150 different authors, maybe 175, we could have 175 different partner organizations, in terms of where those authors are working.
And are those author teams selected from like the pool of people who submitted nominations? I know there was a nomination period that I think closed back in early January.
Right. So we did have an open call for authors and technical contributors. I'll say that the call for technical contributors, which is like, you're not an author, you're not one of the writers, but you are contributing information or data, that is still open. So people who want to self-nominate to make technical contributions still can. But then we did close the call for authors, and we're providing that list to our chapter leads, but they're not required to pull their authors from there. They likely will pull many of them just because these are the people who already raised their hand and stepped forward and are leaning into this process, but they're not required to do so.
Right, thank you very much. Cassie.
Hi, thanks, Tessa. This was really helpful. I am Cassie Rose. I work for the U.S. Climate Alliance. We're an alliance of 24 states and territories who are committed to ambitious climate action. And so I was curious, as part of the assessment, if there is a plan, in addition to doing this sort of national level assessment, data gathering, and producing any data products, if state level assessments will be part of that, or if state and territory level will be available as a useful product that could be used in future planning for both climate as well as sort of biodiversity, wildlife action plans, all sorts of planning that could benefit.
Yeah, thanks, Cassie, for that question. I am with you that that would be an incredibly useful product. And if you're familiar with the National Climate Assessment, it sounds like you are. They also have regional tools, and they have the atlas that specifically designed to let you drill down into geographic areas of interest and use that very specific spatial information for a lot of really good reasons. I don't know at this point if in the report, if the chapter teams will decide to layer geography on top of their work, or whether they will stay national. I think there are compelling reasons on both sides of that question. What I do know is that we do not have the capacity to do the interactive type of tool that you're dreaming of and that I'm dreaming of with this first national nature assessment. We are on a shoestring budget and a super fast timeline, and there's 3 of us on staff. And so we just don't have capacity for this, but if we do a good job with this first one, there will be a second one. And I think that would be something we would be recommending to advance in the future NNAs.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I'd love to send you a follow-up email just to learn a little bit more and maybe chat about talking with our members, because I think they'd be super interested to hear. And if it's helpful for you also to keep engaging with state level stakeholders, that's something that they love to do all the time.
Please, yeah, send me an email. Thank you.
Great. I will make sure to send an email connecting you two after the call today. Okay, Anna.
Thanks, Tessa. This has been super interesting. I'm Anna McGinn with the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. We're based in DC and mostly do work on bringing educational resources to members of Congress and their staff on climate, energy, and environment topics. So naturally, my question is about Congress, and I'm curious kind of to what extent you've heard interest from any, congressional offices or committees about this assessment. Are they engaging at all? And do you have any hopes for how this might be policy relevant as you put it together?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Nice to meet you, Anna. So our mantra at the U.S. Global Change Research Program is that we are policy relevant and not policy prescriptive. And so that often means that we want to keep a healthy distance between ourselves and any current elected. What I know is that when I look at the NCA as a model, they have, once their report is published, they have been asked to provide briefings. And I expect that if we are asked to provide briefings, we would be more than happy and able to do that. But at the moment, we are not being super proactive about this for for reasons that we want to be sure that we are not being policy prescriptive, and we're relying on our federal agencies to help guide us in that direction.
Okay. Thanks, Anna. Any other questions for Dr. Francis? So one of the things I thought was really interesting and helpful about the national climate assessment is sort of the back end, the kind of individual chapter kind of sessions that have been going on over the last few months, where members of the public have a chance to ask questions and interact with the author teams for each chapter. Kind of on the back end of that, would you envision a similar process taking place with this assessment?
Yeah, I hope so. I really think so. There's been a whole lot of post-production work. There have been so many webinars, so many workshops, a podcast, an audiobook, and some of that has been report-wide and some of it has been chapter by chapter. We're really reliant, I think that National Climate Assessment is really reliant on those active chapter leads to help kind of push those messages out and do that engagement. But I think that is really where the report for the NCA report has become so powerful. And so that's part of my project plan, is the sort of like 2027 engagement plan. After we have the report finished, I really hope that we can totally copy the NCA 5 and what they've been doing.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Francis?
Yeah, just one question. I realize this is maybe a little bit cart before horse, but wondering if you mentioned this as the kind of first example of the National Nature Assessment. If this one goes off well, there would be a second one. Do you envision that kind of going on that 5-year cycle similar to the NCAs?
Yeah, I think that I think they might be on a 4-year cycle. And we could be on a 4-year cycle, or we could be on a shorter cycle. The National Climate Assessment has gotten so huge. Like their first one, they're on a 4-year cycle because that's what they're told to be, but also it's been driven by how big they are. We are going to be much smaller. We're going to be like 25% of the 5th NCA, just in terms of sheer volume of our report. So in practice, we probably could crank them out more rapidly. On the other hand, you have to ask yourself, like, over what period of time do we think things are changing enough to warrant an update? And probably for something like 4 years makes sense there. You maybe don't want to do a whole new report just to add another data point. On the other hand, because we're on sort of a shoestring this time, a second one, we would probably want to add so many more components to it that we may want to get on that sooner than 4 years. So that's a wishy-washy way of saying, I don't know. It's not prescribed right now. We don't have a cycle.
Yeah, understood. I appreciate just getting a sense of the potential timeline for that. And certainly some of those chapters, anything related to climate change and climate-driven impacts, could use updates probably pretty quickly, but other chapters might take a little bit more time to pull together. So this was really great info. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Quick question from George Leonard from the Ocean Conservancy. Did you mention when the chapter leads' names would be made public?
I didn't mention it, but any day now, because like I said, we have confirmations and yeses from all but one. So you actually may start to see, and we've told individual chapter leads that they can start making announcements internally and externally that they've been selected for this prestigious position. But we are not going to announce until we have everybody in place. But it really should be just days, George, because I'm chomping at the bit.
Okay, super helpful. Hey, Nathan, can I just follow up on that?
Absolutely.
You guys hear me okay? So,
Yep.
yeah, so I'm chief scientist at Ocean Conservancy. We, of course, care about the ocean. And I'm just wondering, how do you see this? Of course, there's a lot of different habitats, right, and ecosystems in the ocean. How do you see sort of the habitat nature of this being divvied up? At what scale of sort of ecosystem resolution will the writing take place?
Yeah, totally good question. And I also am curious. I also have the same question because I don't know, because we are giving the chapter leads wide berth. We're giving them a lot of freedom to structure their chapters the way they want to. So we have not prescribed specifics in that way. So they could, you know, the status, and I will say the status and trends of nature and the status and trends of the drivers of nature are essentially double wide chapters. They're twice the length of the other chapters. Everybody's working within a strict word limit, so they will have more space and they will need more space. It could be that they decide that what they want to do is just structure their chapter totally by habitat. It's maybe not the way I would do it, but you know, I'm not a chapter lead, and that may be what they decide to do. And so they've got an ocean section, and then they have an oceans expert on the group who weighs in heavily based on, you know, their experience and perspective about how to do that. But we're not going to prescribe that level of detail for the chapters.
So once the chapter lead names are made public, you mentioned that kind of the call for technical guidance is still open. Would people then just touch base directly with the chapter lead, or would they still go through kind of the USGRCP?
Yeah, so they would still, I mean, so we will leave that portal open, the contribute site. If you go to the US Global Change Research Program website, there will be a link to a system that we call contribute. And that will remain open, and that is going to be the preferred way because it will collect a whole lot of information in one go. And then that will be made available to the chapter leads to pull from as they need. But basically, they're going to have these author teams of 10 to 15 people, and that's not going to be enough to write their chapters, probably. They're going to need additional contributions. And so they will basically look at their team and they'll say, oh, we've got a gap over here. We need some expertise here. So let me go to the contribute site and see if there's anybody who's offering not to be an author, but offering to provide some technical advice or some information or data set. It'll work that way. But they also can go outside of contribute for contributions. But I think using the contribute site is definitely the preferred method.
Great. Well, thank you for clarifying that. Anna, another question from you?
Yeah, sorry to come in again, but I'm just curious, beyond sort of responding to the public comment opportunities, are there things that groups that are part of this coalition or that this coalition overall could be contributing or supporting with as you go through this endeavor over the next couple years? I feel like there's a lot of power in these groups together to be supportive of this effort. So just curious if you have any particular things in mind.
Yeah, well, so you mentioned, so we're going to have, just in terms of the official public comment opportunities. So there's the technical contributions, which are not really responding to everything. They're just saying, I am an expert. I have a contribution to make. You haven't necessarily asked for it, but here's what I think should be in it. Then we have products that are going to come out from the author teams that people can weigh in on. So there will be our outline that will be published in August. There will be opportunity for written comment, and there will be opportunity for in-person engagement. So we'll do more listening in sessions around the outline in the fall after it comes out. And then we'll do a similar thing with basically our third draft. So this is a draft that's like 95% done. This is the draft that goes out to the public. It gets published in the Federal Register. It goes to the National Academies for peer review. We do more tribal engagements and more public workshops and engagements around that draft. And that will be in the fall and winter of 2026. So early 2026 is the engagement time around that draft. So that's a second opportunity to look at a product and say, I'd like to make some comments. You could be selected by the national academies to be a peer reviewer. They are going to be creating an ad hoc review committee, probably through a public call. And then this is something that is unique to the way USGCRP does things. So the National Academy, the review committee, will conduct a peer review of this third draft of the National Nature Assessment. They will provide a study, it's called a consensus study report, and then they will get a panel of reviewers to review their review. And that, I think that is also an open call process. And so in terms, if there are people who are interested in being peer reviewers and believe they have the expertise, there could be opportunities for that as well.
Well, we will certainly, as U.S. Nature for Climate, publicize any published public commenting opportunities, and if appropriate, coordinate meetings to kind of discuss sort of coalition-wide approaches to those as well. So any other questions? So just from the USN4C perspective, obviously, we're really happy to see kind of such a focus on sort of the intersection between nature and climate as well. One of the things that we're really pushing are kind of strategies that have kind of benefits for both. We actually had a campaign about a year and a half ago that was specifically called Conservation is Climate Action, focused on sort of those kind of co-benefits, if you will, and kind of the synergistic nature between the two. Is there anything more that you could kind of add about the nature and climate chapter and how it might sort of explore those synergies?
Yeah, again, I don't really know. Like we have a lot of people in our universe who are, of course, experts on nature-based solutions to climate, and there's a lot of that thinking represented within our team already, including among the chapter leads. And the chapter, the climate chapter is going to be interesting because there's also an expectation. And even if there wasn't an expectation, we're guessing that there will be climate themes that emerge within each of the other chapters. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how the authors work together to coordinate those messages so that the important key messages bubble through and don't get lost in the sort of body of the report. But I really again, with most of these things, we're pretty hands-off with the chapter teams in terms of what they write about intentionally. When we're hiring the experts and they are not we. And so we're going to let them decide how to scope their chapters. And you'll see at least their first effort at doing that in the zero order draft.
Would it be
in the outline?
Would it be appropriate to have a call similar to this with like the lead of the lead author of that chapter at some point in this process?
Yeah, it's possible. Like we have thought about providing author teams upon request with basically expert testimony. If they're like, we would like to know more about a certain topic to help us inform our chapter because we lack expertise within the author group and we can't add any more authors. And we have thought about ways to respond to those requests, whether it's by, our first go-to would be to go to the national academies and say, can you pull together an expert group, a half-day, seminar on this topic? Our authors need it. But we haven't really nailed down exactly how we would respond to those requests. And so if your group wanted to raise its hand as expert on a particular topic or set of topics, you could certainly share that with me and with Phil. And we're compiling a whole lot of input that we've gotten from all the listening sessions and also just sort of things that rise to the level of maybe a little bit, have a bit more weight than just individual comments, like real strong advice that we're getting for authors. We've been compiling those to share with the author teams once they're convened. So, that would be certainly appropriate. If you wanted to share sort of an offer or a perspective from this group with me and Phil that you wanted us to pass on to author teams.
Great, thank you for that. George, you got another question?
Yeah, thanks for that, Nathan. So a little away from the science, I'm not sure if this is a fair question to ask or not, but as we know, there may or may not be a change in federal administration during the time period that this work is going on. Do you anticipate, if there is a change in administration, that might influence this work, or is this largely kind of protected from any political considerations?
So the U.S. Global Change Research Program was created by an act of Congress in 1990, and it's under that congressional mandate that it does its work. So it will continue to do its work regardless of who is in the White House. In addition, the federal agencies that are the family of the U.S. Global Change Research Program continue to do their work regardless of who is in the White House. So that's what I know about that topic.
Great. We have about 5 minutes left. So any other kind of parting questions or thoughts or comments before we wrap up? All right. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Francis, for sharing your perspective and insight and presentation with this group. It was really helpful. And what I will do on the back end is I'll send out an email with a recording. So if you want to share that to everybody who sort of was on the invite, so that those who could not attend can watch the recording, and you can feel free to forward that around to others in your organization as well. I'll also share some helpful links to some of the, for example, Federal Register commenting periods that have already taken place, just because there's a lot of useful information often packed in those Federal Register pages. So I will send that out today or tomorrow as well. And I also want to just thank everybody from the U.S. Nature for Climate Coalition who joined this call as well, and really appreciate your interest in the topic. And so we will definitely be keeping tabs on this the next few years, and look forward to hearing more, Dr. Francis, as this process continues.
Please do stay in touch. Thank you so much for this chance to give you guys this update. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Take care.
Thanks for organizing this, Nathan. And thank you.
Thank you, Nathan.
Francis.
Yeah,
Thanks,
my pleasure.
Catherine. Bye.